Okay? So I need 10 volunteers, probably on that side because it's too tough for you guys. Okay, you're 1, 2, 3. Come on, step up. 4, 5, 6. 4 more. 7. 9. 8. 2 more.
This isn't a GA or the dictator.
No, 2 more. 2 more. 9. 10. We need a 10. Okay, and we need 10 people to go over there with 10 chairs. Take 10 chairs. 10 chairs. 10 chairs. 10 people. 10 chairs.
Fortune 10.
10 people, 10 chairs. Now, just line them up. Line them up. Right here. Line them up. Right here.
Oh, line them up.
Line them up. Line them up. Right here. Right here. Sorry. Okay. Now, just imagine that. No, stand up. Stand up. Just imagine that each one of you, the 10 that are up here, represents 10% of the population. So you're 10%, you're 10%, 10%, 10%. And each chair, put the chairs in front of you. Each chair represents 10% of the resources we have in this country. 10%. Okay? Now, if we lived in a really fair society, each 10% would own roughly about 10% of the resources, right? In a fair society.
Sorry, I object to almost all of your positions, so I might shake my head a lot.
Okay,
But I
that's
won't
fine.
say anything.
No, I want you to. This is... So, okay, so the way that it's set up now, there are 20% of the people roughly own 84% of the resources. Resources are finite. So you've got 2 people, and the rest of you move away from 8.5 chairs. You've got 2 people. 2 people. All right? That's your chair. That's your chair. 2 people. 20% of the people, roughly 8.5 chairs. So you have to imagine that's chairs split in half. Okay? And the rest of you now have to try to use 1.5 chairs. Can you do it? Someone's going to be homeless. People are going to be homeless. People are going to starve. This is what it's like. This is what we've got. This is what we're working with now. You've got, 84% of the people trying to share 16% of the resources. And these pigs over here, 20%, have 8.5 chairs. They can't even use them all. Can you see? Lay across them. Lay across them. See if you can use them all. Lay across them. I'm sure. And yet, we still have people unseated over here on the 1.5. Even more. We've got roughly 40%. So take 4 chairs owned by 1%. Represents the shoe. 1% represents the shoe. 40% owned. 1% owns 40% of it, and that's what we're dealing with today. That's the kind of money we're talking about today. Sorry, I hope my feet. So anyway, that's just to give you of an example of what we're up against. Poison acronyms, okay?
Mary Beth?
Yeah.
Yeah, don't want to slow your rhythm at all, but if you, the numbers on wealth that you cited are correct when you include housing, but most people that own their own primary residence, they don't draw income from it. So if you only consider, if you exclude housing wealth and you only consider financial investments from cash to pensions to stocks and bonds, the 1% actually own more than the 99% combined.
Here's
the
our,
numbers.
here's our resident
Yeah,
stockbroker.
nobody. It's 1% own more financial wealth than the rest of the country combined.
That's if you
Yeah.
take housing out.
See,
You just take housing out and you look at actual investments that make you money.
The average middle-class person owns a house, but they're not making any money out of it.
That doesn't make any sense. Houses have value. Money doesn't have value until you put it into something. A house is.
I was just giving you the numbers for exclude. I'll just stop there.
Okay.
It's just housing out of it because housing isn't that great anyway for investment.
I disagree, but investment is something different than quality of life. The
Yeah,
money,
absolutely.
the amount of money that you're taking in interest or whatever it's not comparable to all of the things that. I mean, I don't get money from my car. I lose money on my rent, but I choose to make those decisions because they add to my quality of life. So I think saying 99% of people own
Less than the 1%.
Yes, that's that doesn't really make sense. But okay.
Well, essentially, there's a few at the top that control most of the resources. That's what we're talking about. But at the expense of the rest of us. Okay? So,
But by resources,
Yeah,
do
go
you
ahead.
mean money? Because I see them as different things.
well, no, it could be land.
There's
You know.
there's a difference between, like you were saying, like there's property and cars which you own, but you're not necessarily making
Right.
money off of it. But yet you are choosing to invest in that, so it could be a form of wealth. At the same time, it's not something that you can liquidate really easily because when,
That's right.
well,
Lose
it
the
does matter
value,
in the
like-
wild.
You lose 2/3 of the value as soon as that car hits the pavement.
And how much does a CEO of Enron or whatever company lose when the whole corporation goes bankrupt? So a lot of times they walk away scot-free.
Absolutely.
But there are people who are
Lose their
ruined,
jobs.
ruined because their business
Right.
fails and literally have nothing, their house and all that stuff.
We're
goes
talking
away.
about major conglomerates here, corporations. They're the ones with the seats at the table, okay? So we're talking about American Legislative Executive Council, or ALEC. And please, I love the participation. Elizabeth, I
I'll
love
stop
it.
interrupting.
No, I don't want you to. That's the point I'm trying to make. I want you to speak up, okay? That's what this teaching is, I think. I'm not supposed to. I don't have enough smart things to say for 50 minutes. Believe me. So there's ALEC, there's Americans for Prosperity, but I like to call it Americans for Billionaire Prosperity. And that's the funders. And we'll go. Yeah, we'll go into that. They founded Americans for Prosperity, and they've fostered and grew the Tea Party, the Tax Enough Already Party. Yeah, go ahead.
I wouldn't say that they started the Tea Party movement, they co-opted it. But to say that
Maybe
they
they
fostered
co-opted
it, yeah,
They fostered it by throwing a lot of money into it.
into the co-opted part of it.
Yeah, you're right. I like the distinction. I don't know a lot about Free Staters. I'm not going to talk to them because everybody has different motivations.
Hi, I'm a
Hi,
Free
that's
Stater.
good. That's good. I'm
So
glad.
am I.
I want you guys to talk about it.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
I don't know enough about it, but I do know about ALEC and AFP. And so here's basically how it works. We have ALEC. It consists of complicit legislators, major corporations, state legislators that are complicit, and they buy seats to a table like this. I mean, an imaginary table. Okay? So it's corporations like Pfizer. Big Pharma's represented big time. ExxonMobil, Walmart, Koch Industries, which they have a lot of spheres of influence, the Koch brothers. So they create that model legislation that really is there to foster freeway for big business. No regulations, no minimum wage requirements, no health care requirements. Everything for big business and to foster it. Yes.
Yeah, and it's very important that they spin this definitely under the banner of freedom in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
which I think one of the problems that we've had is occupiers dealing with. We're all kind of touching on like the libertarian free stater aspect because it seems like we clash sometimes on ideals. But I think that if we really come together, that we would see that, like, some of this is, a lot of this is BS. But
Oh yeah, I totally agree.
Right,
But I
the-
disagree on the causes.
Right, but the idea of the freedom that we should be motivated by that as individuals within like a
We're going
better
to talk a
market
little
is
bit
good.
about values, so I'm
Cool.
glad you brought it up. But we're going to,
Yeah.
talk about it. I just want to show you the mechanisms of what you're up against. AFP is Americans for Prosperity, and they're largely the funders. And what's happened since Citizen United decision is that we don't know who's putting money into AFP, but AFP is funding all of this legislation. ALEC, the legislators that are also funding, or actually carrying out ALEC's policies. So that's the problem. There's no transparency. Okay, we don't see who is actually giving this money.
Is the Chamber of Commerce a part of ALEC?
Chamber of Commerce, the National Chamber of Commerce has a seat at the table. However, there are, individual chapters that, have nothing to do with that. Okay? Peterborough Chamber of Commerce, for example. It's a great organization. They're not involved in this. Okay? Then you have the media mouthpieces, which have been purchased. Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, has a big hand to play in this. Rush Limbaugh as well. And they've largely purchased the Supreme Court. And they've duped some of the people, the co-opted people, to vote against their own self-interests. Okay?
I noticed 4 of them aren't wearing jackets.
That's the minority opinion.
It's all to foster the fat cat corporatism. I love cats, but that cat has got too much.
Damn fat.
So again, the co-opted part of the Tea Party movement.
The grassroots.
Yes.
What's the mechanism for that support of the Supreme Court? How does the influence work on the court? How do they get the money? You got one of those jackets that's got McDonald's on it. I mean, is that
Well, they're actually they're
theoretically they're independent, right?
Theoretically they're independent, but in practice they actually vote with corporatists. They have an agenda.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
guess,
Yeah, I think it's worthy to point out with that question the controversy over Clarence Thomas and
Absolutely, thank you.
his wife.
What's your name again?
Catherine Talbot.
Catherine.
And his wife, who has gotten a lot of donations from large corporations that support anti-legislation, basically are aligned with this motivation. And he has taken a lot of money for speaking tours and supported her efforts, and then they find that his voting tends to really align a lot with what she was doing, and then he is able to get
Right.
matters. So, I mean, because they have a decision. If they have certain things before the bench to consider, they have the ability to decide whether they're going to hear an argument or not. And that's extremely powerful right there. A lot of arguments have been dismissed and not heard, and particularly like the class action lawsuit of Walmart employees, one that comes to my mind immediately.
Oh, absolutely.
So it could be argued that there is some undue influence on the perspective and the position of the judges and their viewpoint. And maybe it's because that's all that they get for information. I don't know, but we can go into that argument forever. But that's just to elucidate on that.
Thank you, Catherine.
A question over here.
Mary Beth,
Yes,
impartial answer to that gentleman's question.
this is Melissa Bernard.
There's kind of also indirect corporate influence on the justices because they are appointed on a vote of Congress, right?
That's right.
And so the campaign contributions to the Congress people thereby influence who Congress will support for the
It's the
appointment.
funders that are behind this.
They're also
The
appointed
funders.
by presidents, aren't they? They're appointed and then voted.
Nominated and then
Nominated.
They're
Right,
appointed by
nominated by
It's nominated by the
Right.
president and then voted on.
nominated by presidents
By the
and
Senate.
voted on.
Yeah, if I could just add that it's some of the recent Supreme Court justices that are added, especially in the Bush era. If you look at it, I mean, every single person in the public for 30 years looked at Supreme Court through the lens of abortion and social issues. that was actually a red herring for most of the population. What people didn't know is that many of these justices, the ones that were approved, Roberts, Alito, you look at their records, it was strongly pro-corporate on a number of issues. We're dealing with the environment, dealing with labor rights. So this whole thing about like the social issues, while they're extremely important, they were somewhat of a smokescreen to a deep corporatist element within the Supreme Court that was getting funneled through the whole way. It was a hush-hush issue.
May I just throw out to invite other people to, and I don't want to distract your cause, but
No.
to look at the term tenthers. The 10th Amendment was an amendment about interstate commerce, and that was a movement during the turn of the century, or early 1800s actually, when they talked about regulating food, when the child labor laws, union issues. The argument at the time was against that because the federal government had no right to restrict trade under the 10th Amendment, and that was used as a means to block any kind of federal action towards social justice and action on that. So the tenthers the tenther movement has really been revived, and strict constitutionalists have a tendency to view the tenther movement as an absolutist kind of viewpoint and use the argument of interstate commerce and states' rights over federal rights. So that's something that the Supreme Court gets into quite often.
You had something to say. What's your name? I'm sorry.
Pete. That, the whole thing with the justices, man, it's a chicken and the egg situation, because there's no way for us to tell, looking in from the outside, whether they're being supported, whether the legislators or who are voting on laws or approving judges are doing that because that's what they believe in, and therefore people support them monetarily, or they're doing it because they're getting supported monetarily. You see the distinction? There's no way to tell. I'm sure there's some who are, just doing what they believe is right and getting money because people agree with them, and there's others who are changing their opinion because of the money. There's no way to tell, and that's why we have to get the money out so we know, that their actions are only incented by our votes.
Thank you, Pete. They're not alone. I mean, there are many.
Was that the
David and Charles Koch. You want to see him again?
It looks like Stephen Colbert.
It's an old Colbert.
His father.
There's also the Mellon Scapes, that Carnegie Mellon fortune in Pittsburgh. That's Richard Mellon Scape. And there's others, but I pointed out some of the more egregious ones. And this is Adolf Coors IV, heir to the beer empire. Okay. AFP was founded with the support of David Koch and Koch Industries. Now, they actually, AFP is the Americans for Prosperity, and it's a Washington, D.C. based political advocacy group, and they promote economic policy that supports business to the exclusion of business, and restrains regulation by government. They were a major supporter of all the Republican candidates in the 2010 election cycle, and they're heavily involved in legislation that aimed at reducing regulation for oil and gas. And so a lot of the environmental, yes, Sylvia.
And one of their spin-offs is the Cato Institute, which is primarily right-wing regressive, guises itself as actually economic research, but if you look at it carefully, it's probably junk science.
What Elizabeth has a burning desire to speak.
To say that the Cato Institute is an extreme right-wing institution is a wild exaggeration. They do support economic policies that the left wing would disagree with, but they also support lots of policies that the right wing vehemently disagrees with. They were against the Iraq War. They were against the Patriot Act. They draw attention to police brutality. They draw attention to issues of marriage equality. And so they're not right-wing or left-wing. They're something else. And they do have principles. Whether or not you agree with those principles
Fair enough, Elizabeth. Thank you.
I was an intern at the Cato Institute,
Okay.
so I know a lot of those
You're an
people.
insider. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, Catherine.
I also want to make a clarification as a small business person that when we say business in this
I meant
sense,
large business.
we mean international, global,
Absolutely.
large businesses.
Yes, I have a business too.
And we're hurt by their policies.
Absolutely. Yes, Pete.
It's one of the nuance there because, there's all this talk of less regulation. What really goes on is that the super large businesses, they like some regulations. They like the regulations that give them a competitive advantage, and they like regulations that kind of go along with what they're already doing and what a small business would have a really hard time doing if they were required to do it. So the less regulation thing is kind of another red herring. They don't really necessarily want that in all cases. It's just a rallying cry.
As long as they've bought our government, it's going to go their way. So,
Right, and it's easy for people to think with our 99% slogan that we're against people who are wealthy or
Yeah.
corporation, but just because it could be taken as a blanket statement. But really, I think what we're against is how much influence and how much destruction has been done by the people who have all that money.
Thanks.
It's not that they have the money in the first place; they're more than welcome to become wealthy.
it's not monolithic. Not all rich people are the same, okay? We're not talking about that here. There's unconscionable evil happening, though, on the for profit, unconscionable evil. Not all wealthy people are unconscionably evil, okay? So point well taken. Thank you. Koch Industries are considered and called in certain networks the Kochtopus. So, their sphere of influence is wide. They're into a lot of different things: oil, plastics, paper products, chemicals. I could probably get a list to Sylvia or somebody of their products so that you at least know and can be informed when you go to the store to purchase things.
Most building products.
Yes, most building products. Thank you. Yes, Elizabeth.
The Koch brothers gave $10 million to the ACLU to fight the Patriot Act.
Yeah.
So they're not single-minded.
No, they're not. And I was
There's-
going to point that out. On this slide, Makadee put together, they're philanthropists. They have not done, they've done good things as well with their money. The problem is they're trying to control our government and everything that's associated with it. They're giving money to universities. They're giving money to university economic departments, but that's great. But then they want to tell the professors what to teach. That's wrong. Okay, that's just simply wrong. Okay, so their sphere is wide. They're into a lot of different things. Not all of it is bad. Okay, as Elizabeth pointed out. There is a goal. The goal of a lot of these corporations is to, operate with free hand. Okay, there is one country in the world that has no central government at this point, and that is Somalia. And as Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century philosopher, said, like a solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short, if there's no central authority. Now, governments can intrude in our lives, definitely. But the vision that the Koch brothers, ALEC, AFP have is to have intrusion into all of our lives, but not their major enterprises. Yes, go ahead.
The deal in Somalia is that as you've shown on the map, it's a very tribal, and the tribes for a while operated on their own system, their own code, and they traded with each other. And then the UN came in and said, this is a simplification obviously, but the UN came in and said, you need a central government. We're going to hand power to somebody and help you establish a central government. And that's when they all started killing each other to get in control of that central government.
Well, obviously this is a simplified.
Right, but Somalia is a terrible example of anarchy.
It's a pure free market.
No, it really is not at all.
It's not.
Go ahead.
And northern Somaliland, everything above Mudu,
Yep.
That whole northern part. That's pretty much an self-declared sovereign state, and it has a central government.
Okay. Point well taken. Thank you. I appreciate that. The point is that if you're really wealthy enough to own a militia and own enough ammunition and own enough guns and live in a gated community, you're going to be fine in Somalia. Okay? That's the point. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the other point to bring up as well is people like to talk about Somalia, but the whole entire country of Africa, areas of Latin America, and many countries have been colonized by big money and big business for 300 years. So when white people left Africa, they just left a mess, and the Africans had to straighten it out and figure it out for themselves.
I wanted to bring this back home a little bit, and there's a fellow by the name of Horn. I can't remember his first name off the top of my head. Do you remember Horn? It's David Bernie Horn. Yes, and he wrote a book called Framing the Future. And there are certain values that are universal. We all can embrace them. Freedom, opportunity, security. They may mean different things depending on our partisan petticoats or whatever we have on at the time. But we all can agree that these are values that we as human beings can embrace. Freedom, opportunity, security. So I want to do a little exercise. But first, when you think of freedom, and I have no doubt that any of you will participate. So when you think of freedom, what comes to mind? What values come to mind to you? Anyone? Liberty, privacy, basic rights, fundamental rights, civil liberties, choice, speech, autonomy, religious freedom. Pardon?
Birth control.
Birth control. Yeah, that overlaps in some of the other areas as well.
Freedom of assembly.
Free to be women.
Freedom of assembly. Thank you.
Civil rights.
Rights revolution.
Civil rights. How about opportunity? It depends on who you are, but what does the value mean for you?
Well, it's an opportunity. I guess my reaction was opportunity is what we say we are, but I think there's a lot of people who, even if you follow the so-called rules that used to be, if you are a certain gender, or you're a certain ethnic, a certain race, or a certain age, it doesn't count. Because I've hit that age. I'm female, I'm divorced, I'm 50.
Yeah, so you're talking about level playing field,
right.
equal opportunity.
Right, it's like, go to school, do this, do that, do the other thing. You do all those things, then you can't get a job, the courts take your kids, whether you're the better parent or not. It's, as my clients used to say, America's effed up. And I couldn't, as a counselor, I'm sitting here going, yeah, I'm supposed to be counseling you otherwise, but I'm thinking to myself, so.
Right. Well, that's the point of this, it is effed up. It's effed up. It wasn't supposed to always happen that way. Security, what comes to mind, what values come to mind with security? Safety, quality of life, protection, health security, that could be a value.
Absence of insecurity.
No
anxiety.
That's right. Yeah.
No unreasonable searches and seizures.
That's a wonderful one. Absolutely. Now, to bring it home to New Hampshire, there are model legislation, pieces of legislation that ALEC has sponsored, AFD has funded, and our complicit legislators have put into bills. When we go out to the community and we talk to our neighbors, our friends, our families, we want to lead with these values. So there are certain, for example, House Bill 089 and House Bill 440 requires the Attorney General to join or file lawsuits challenging what they call Obamacare or EPA standards, cap and trade, whatever. These violate and trample on many of our values. So when we go out, yes, did you have a question or disagreement?
I guess I slightly disagree on some cases. Right, because in a way, especially from a libertarian point, you could see this very easily as the federal government telling states what to do in terms of health care. And I'm not saying it's wrong in one way or another, but I can see why it would be a legitimate concern.
But can we see how maybe having clean air, clean water is something, a value that we can all embrace.
Yeah.
Right.
That having access to health care that's affordable is something we can all embrace. When we go out to the communities and we talk to our friends and families and neighbors, we want to lead with those kinds of values when we're talking to them about who's representing us in Concord, who's representing us in Washington, D.C. We lead with our values, because that's how people vote. They don't vote on being a policy wonk or, they vote on their values. And there are core values: freedom, opportunity, security, and all that entails. That's where we go to. That's what we use when we go out to talk to people about who to vote for, what to vote for. Yes.
I think whether or not you agree with what you see on the screen as something that's legitimate to pursue, I think the issue that I have with it is that it did not come from the New Hampshire senators or legislators. It came from a third party, ALEC, who wrote a paragraph and supported financially someone here in New Hampshire who's apparently not bright enough to come up with that on their own. They have to get it from ALEC. That's what my issue is.
Yeah.
Some things that come in front of the legislature, I'm okay with. But what ticks me off is that they're not coming from the people that were elected here. They're coming from this outside party.
Right.
That's
And I
a New
think
Hampshire.
that's what the issue
Yes,
is.
That's a New
yes.
Hampshire value.
Right.
We don't, people come in
But
and tell
these,
us.
I want you to know that these are happening. These kinds of bills are happening in Wisconsin. They're happening
Everywhere,
in Ohio.
because
They're
Alex
happening in
sending
Florida.
them all
They're
around.
happening-
1,000 bills being got into state legislatures this year.
That's a good question.
Yes.
How are these things being presented to the legislators? Is it individuals that work for ALEC?
Through ALEC.
Yeah.
They sit at the table.
They
They've been invited to the table and they've paid for it.
So these individuals come from D.C. or something to New Hampshire?
Legislators go to them, to their conferences. And I'm just going to create a balance there, too. There is another national legislative association. It's called the National State Council on Legislatures. That is not corporately funded. Therein lies the difference.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
And I'm told we have a 15-minute warning.
Okay, I will. Here's some of the things that these bills have done in New Hampshire. Okay, they slashed state funding. They put severely disabled people on waiting lists for services. They denied services to 7,000 poor mentally ill people. You read it. You can see what this kind of legislation has done. Okay, it wasn't always sure.
But I just want to state that that's,
Yeah.
to put a human face on that, I deal with people in Manchester, I'm one of the lower 1%. And, just the cuts to mentally ill people meant that, I remember we were talking about that, and they presented it to a community group. That meant that people who needed service for severe mental illness were cut off and no longer able to get services. It means that now that the Section 8 housing waiting list is 6 years. Just for people that are in emergency to get housing. It's horrendous. I have people that are on disability, they can barely survive. And if they didn't have food stamps and public funding of anything, they would be on the streets.
Look at our earlier exercise with the number of chairs, okay? You had 1.5 chairs that those people have to share, okay? That all of those people have to share. It's just... So, I want to hurry up a little bit, but, this wasn't always supposed to be this way. Our founding fathers envisioned a republic, a representative democracy, and, dependent on the people alone, as the Federalists even put it, dependent on the people alone. Okay? And what's happened is Washington was supposed to be dependent on the people, or you can replace Concord there. But the problem is that they're dependent on the funders because they want to get reelected. They spent 30 to 70% of their time in Congress on getting reelected. So that's a problem, big problem. That's why the funders are not the people, In 1939, and this I borrowed from our friend Larry Lessig. In 1939, FDR had to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy, against the fascists that were marching across Europe. My father was a World War II We now have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save our democracy, not from fascists, or, well, maybe they are fascists, I don't know, but from the corporatists, from the oligarchy, from the fat cats. Sorry, Cat, I'm sorry. What's the antidote? Yeah, obviously, you guys already, I mean, we're preaching to the choir here. You're the antidote. Occupy everywhere, you know, occupy. And I want to end it with, anybody know this woman?
Granny D.
Granny D, Doris D. Heck. And she marched in 1999. She marched across, I think it was 1998. She left the Rose Bowl Tournament of Roses Parade in Pasadena, California, and walked across the country to bring awareness and support for campaign finance reform. She wanted money out of politics. She was an old activist back from 1960. She helped to save an Inuit village from hydrogen bombing and testing. So this woman was, she put her body on the line then, and she put her body on the line by walking across the country. And she was 88 when she started, and she celebrated 2 birthdays when she got to Washington. And obviously it brought a lot of attention. It didn't stop money in politics. But about a year later, I think this was in, I want to read a quote. In 2000, she went with 31 other activists to Washington, D.C. And she was arrested for reading the Declaration of Independence in the Capitol building. She was charged with the offense of demonstrating in the Capitol building. It was said to be a peaceable assembly. Demonstrators were arrested by the Capitol Police nevertheless. She entered a plea of guilty in court, but she made a statement to the court that I want to read to you, and I want to leave you guys with this, where she explained the purpose of her actions. Your Honor, the old woman who stands before you was arrested for reading the Declaration of Independence in America's Capitol building. I did not raise my voice to do so, and I blocked no hall. I was reading from the Declaration of Independence to make the point that we must declare our independence from the corrupting bonds of big money in our election campaigns. In my 90 years, this is the first time I have been arrested. I risk my good name, for I do indeed care about what my neighbors think about me. But, Your Honor, some of us do not have much power, except to put our bodies in the way of an injustice, to picket, to walk, or to just stand in the way. It will not change the world overnight, but it is all we can do. So that's how I would like to end it. If you have any comments, please feel free. Yes?
I wanted to talk about the decision the U.S. Supreme Court just made in Montana, and how I just read it from
The Supreme Court.
The state
made
Supreme
decision?
Court.
State Supreme.
No, the U.S. Supreme, the U.S. I can read it from HuffPost.
Please,
It's really
please do.
Awesome. The U.S. Supreme Court blocked the Montana Supreme Court's December 2011 decision upholding the state's century-old ban on corporate political spending. So that's bad. The implications of this are huge, as it paves the way for a potential reopening of this disastrous Citizens United decision that has spawned billionaire-sponsored super PACs. And if that happens, Chief Justice John Roberts better buckle up for a grassroots mobilization unlike any the court has seen in years. And so I think the whole Citizens United is going to blow up, and I think Montana's the place where it's going to get started.
The Supreme Court supported Montana's
They did not.
campaign finance reform. No, they rejected it. So that the state can no longer impose those kinds of
Exactly.
controls.
And so now there's going to be,
They're going to bump it up to the Supreme Court.
yeah,
No, but that wasn't the Supreme Court.
It
Yeah,
was-
so
yep.
So what does that mean for Montana? What's the
Well, there's bigger implications for us.
Basically, it's almost like the federal government's going to be able to trump any law the state makes.
So that's kind of the rule anyway, unless some people can come up and challenge. What has to happen is that the federal Supreme Court has to be willing to hear this. And the only way that we're going to get them to be willing to rehear this issue is if the people all over the country make so much noise that they cannot ignore it, and they have to reopen the issue again.
And that's what this writer is saying, is this writer believes that that's what's going to happen.
Well, it's only if we get out and we make sure
Yes.
that happens. It's
Yep.
our responsibility.
Yep.
The only way to really secure from being able to do that is to take the process of getting a federal constitutional amendment that states they can't, use money as a person.
We could do that too, and it's either way, because the Supreme Court usually, as they provide precedents to go forward, they don't, usually, it's not really felt that they have to have legislation, so they can say that the legislation is nullified by the decision. What really needs to happen is that the decision needs to be overturned.
Yeah, I think what we can do as states, and especially like we were talking about trying to get a state constitutional convention, as long as we try to push it through the way that we can through our states and through our own constitution, it will continue to clash with the Supreme Court's decision between the two constitutions. So that seems to be the best way to make it a continued issue.
Right, but if you want to end the issue, you need to make it a federal constitution.
Well, but it will become a federal issue by making it a state issue, because then they will clash, and then then they'll have to come to some kind of agreement. Either that means it'll have to go to the Supreme Court again.
Yeah, we need some.
You need more numbers.
Big.
You need bigger numbers.
It needs a huge
to
movement
fight
to
that.
get the Supreme Court
Absolutely.
to hear it again.
You're too
They
small
will
right now.
not. They're not
It's-
going to hear it again unless there's an uprising of the people.
Well, the Supreme Court, the current Supreme Court doesn't care about the
You're right.
we need to amend the Constitution so that they have to, so that's clear cut for them, and they can't.
And there you need
That's
a
what I'm
much
saying.
bigger movement.
That's hard to do.
It's hard to do, but it's got to be done.
Exactly.
Either way.
The
Because
rest
they've
of it
already
doesn't really-
interpreted it, and until we get a complete change over the Supreme Court, and even a moderate Supreme Court is reluctant to overturn previous Supreme Court decisions. That takes more than making an original decision. So,
If you don't do a federal constitutional change, by the time they would make a change, there might not be any country left.
That's true.
We barely have.
thank you.
Thank you.